"Come pick up your useless daughter. I don't want her anymore." Those were the last words my husband said to my mother before he laughed and hung up. Exactly 60 seconds later, 6 black Cadillac Escalades rolled into our quiet suburban neighborhood. Every curtain on our street shifted. Every neighbor stopped mowing their lawn. Every child riding a bicycle froze. And my ex-husband, who had just proudly divorced me, stood in the driveway with the divorce papers still in his hand as his entire world began falling apart. He had absolutely no idea who my family really was. My name is Emily Carter, and for 12 years, I believed that loving someone meant standing beside them, even when they forgot how to stand beside you. Looking back now, I realize love isn't supposed to require you to disappear. When I married Daniel, we were just 2 ordinary people trying to build an ordinary American life. We met in Columbus, Ohio. He was working as a junior sales representative for a logistics company. I had recently graduated with a business degree, but accepted a simple administrative position at a local nonprofit because I wanted meaningful work instead of chasing titles. Our first apartment was tiny. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people. The air conditioner rattled every summer. The upstairs neighbors argued every Friday night, but we laughed constantly. Those early years felt rich, even though our bank account certainly wasn't. Daniel used to tell everyone I was his greatest blessing. He'd squeeze my hand while grocery shopping. He'd kiss my forehead before leaving for work. He'd thank me for believing in him whenever another promotion slipped through his fingers. I honestly thought we'd grow old together. Then success slowly changed him. Not overnight. People rarely become strangers in a single day. It happens one compromise at a time. His company expanded. He started making more money. New managers arrived. He began attending expensive business dinners. His coworkers drove German luxury cars. Their wives wore designer handbags. Conversations that once centered around family vacations suddenly revolved around stock portfolios, country clubs, and investment properties. Daniel started comparing our life to theirs. At first, it was harmless. "Maybe next year we'll buy something nicer. Then I wish you were more ambitious." Eventually, my boss's wife owns 2 businesses. Those comparisons became criticisms. The criticism became contempt, and contempt slowly poisoned our marriage. I tried harder. I cooked every evening. I handled every bill. I organized holidays. When his father became sick, I drove him to every doctor's appointment for nearly 8 months while Daniel focused on work. When Daniel lost sleep over quarterly sales numbers, I stayed awake beside him. When he received promotions, I celebrated louder than anyone else. But somehow, nothing I did ever seemed enough anymore. Instead of seeing what I contributed, he only noticed what I didn't. "You never made 6 figures. You don't know powerful people. You have no ambition." Each sentence landed like another brick placed on my shoulders. I kept carrying them anyway because that's what wives do. Or at least that's what I believed. The morning our marriage officially ended started surprisingly quietly. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Coffee filled the house with its familiar smell. I remember thinking maybe today we'd finally have an honest conversation. Instead, Daniel walked inside carrying a manila envelope. He tossed it across the kitchen island. It slid until it stopped directly in front of me. Divorce papers I already signed. His voice sounded almost bored. "As soon as you sign, we're finished." I stared at the papers without touching them. 12 years, I whispered. "That's all they deserve." He shrugged. "I've moved on." There wasn't even anger in his face anymore, just impatience, like someone waiting for a delayed flight. I looked around the kitchen. Every cabinet had been chosen together. Every family photograph had once meant something. The dining table still had tiny scratches from when our nieces carved pumpkins every Halloween. How does a life disappear so quietly? I thought we'd at least talk. We've talked enough. "No, Daniel," I looked directly into his eyes. "You've talked, you've judged, you've decided." He folded his arms. "I'm tired of carrying dead weight." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Dead weight. Not wife, not partner, not best friend. Dead weight. I finally signed. Not because I agreed, because I suddenly realized there was nothing left to save. He snatched the papers before the ink had completely dried. Then he smiled. Not happily, victorious, as though he'd finally won a competition I never knew we were playing. Then came the moment I'll never forget. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling your mother." I blinked. "Why? So she can come collect what's hers." I felt my stomach tighten. "Daniel, don't." He ignored me. The phone rang once, twice, then my mother answered. "Hello." Daniel pressed the speaker button. His grin widened. Mrs. Whitmore, yes, come pick up your useless daughter. Silence. He continued before she could answer. I don't want her anymore. Another brief pause. Then my mother spoke in the calmest voice I'd ever heard. We'll be there in 1 minute. Click. The call ended. Daniel laughed. Actually laughed. Let's see what kind of junk car they show up in. I looked down at the floor, not because I was ashamed, because I already knew exactly what was about to happen. There was one thing Daniel had never been interested enough to ask during our entire marriage. My family. Whenever I mentioned visiting my parents, he always declined. Whenever Mom sent Christmas gifts, he barely looked at the card. Whenever Dad invited us to charity dinners, Daniel claimed he was too busy. He assumed my parents were simply comfortable retirees living outside Cleveland. He never asked what my father had done before retirement. Never asked why my mother was constantly traveling. Never wondered why every charity auction somehow recognized our family. He simply wasn't interested. Until now, exactly 1 minute later. The low rumble of engines echoed through our neighborhood. Daniel frowned. What is that? 6 identical black Cadillac Escalades turned onto our street. Each one gleamed despite the rain. The vehicles stopped perfectly in front of our house. Drivers wearing tailored black suits stepped out almost simultaneously. Daniel's smile disappeared. What the? The rear passenger door of the center SUV opened. A woman in an elegant navy coat stepped onto the wet driveway. Perfect posture, silver hair neatly styled, quiet confidence, my mother. She looked toward me first, not toward Daniel, toward me. Her expression softened. My sweetheart. Then she turned to Daniel. For several long seconds, she simply looked at him, not with anger, not with revenge, just disappointment. Daniel swallowed hard. One of the suited men approached my mother respectfully. Ma'am, everything is ready. Daniel stared at the embroidered logo on the man's jacket, his face slowly drained of color. He knew that logo. It belonged to Whitmore Holdings, the parent company that owned the investment group behind his employer. And for the very first time since I'd known him, my husband looked genuinely afraid. Daniel stared at the embroidered Whitmore Holdings logo as though he'd seen a ghost. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The confidence he'd worn only moments earlier disappeared so completely that I almost didn't recognize the man standing in front of me. One of the chauffeurs quietly stepped beside my mother. Mrs. Whitmore, would you like us to bring Miss Carter's belongings now? Only the personal items, my mother replied gently. Everything else belongs to the past. She wasn't trying to embarrass Daniel. That was the remarkable thing about my mother. She had spent her entire life believing that dignity spoke louder than power ever could. Daniel looked back and forth between us. Whitmore, he whispered, your last name. I gave him a tired smile. I never hid it. You never said I never said my family was poor either. He blinked repeatedly. No, I nodded. No. As 2 employees quietly entered the house with garment bags and storage boxes, my mind drifted backward through the years. Maybe because I suddenly realized this marriage was truly over. Maybe because I wanted to remember the man I'd once fallen in love with instead of the stranger standing before me. We met almost 13 years earlier at a neighborhood volunteer event outside Columbus. A local church was helping repair homes damaged by severe spring storms. I spent the morning painting porches. Daniel spent most of the day installing drywall. By lunchtime, we were sitting on overturned buckets, sharing bottled water and peanut butter sandwiches. He made me laugh, not because he was trying to impress me, because he was genuinely funny. He talked about growing up in a blue-collar family. His father had spent 35 years working at a steel plant. His mother worked as a school secretary. He dreamed of building a stable life, owning a home, raising children, and never worrying about paying bills. Those dreams sounded exactly like mine, or at least the version of mine I wanted to build on my own. By our 3rd date, I knew there was one conversation I needed to have with my parents. Mom smiled the moment I mentioned Daniel. So she poured herself tea. You like him? I do. Does he know about us? I looked out the kitchen window before answering. Not really. Dad folded his newspaper. Why not? Because I don't want him falling in love with our last name. The room became quiet. Finally, Dad nodded. Fair enough. That decision shaped the next 12 years of my life. Not because I wanted to deceive anyone, because I wanted one thing money could never buy. An honest relationship. People often assume children from wealthy families live glamorous lives. Some certainly do. Mine wasn't like that. My grandfather started Whitmore Freight with a single-use delivery truck outside Cleveland nearly 60 years earlier. He drove every route himself, loaded every shipment himself, balanced every invoice at the kitchen table. Eventually, one truck became 5, 5 became 50. Then warehouses, distribution centers, commercial real estate, transportation software, investment partnerships. Over several decades, the company quietly expanded across much of the Midwest. By the time I was born, the business was already worth more money than I could truly comprehend. Yet my parents refused to let wealth define our family. I attended public schools. I had chores. I worked summer jobs. Dad insisted I learn how to balance a checking account before learning how investments worked. Mom volunteered nearly every weekend. Money, she always told me, is simply a tool. Character decides whether that tool builds lives or destroys them. When I graduated college, Dad offered me an executive position inside one of our companies. I declined. I want to earn my own mistakes. He laughed proudly. Good answer. So I rented my own apartment, bought a used Honda Accord, accepted an entry-level nonprofit job earning less than many of my classmates. My parents quietly paid nothing except birthday dinners. If I wanted independence, they intended to respect it completely. Daniel never questioned any of it. He knew my parents lived comfortably. He knew they traveled often. He knew they supported several charities, but he never seemed curious enough to ask deeper questions. When Mom invited us to fundraising galas, he'd glance at the invitation and say, "Those events aren't really my thing." When Dad invited us to Cleveland for Thanksgiving, Daniel usually claimed work was too busy. When my parents sent generous Christmas gifts, he'd smile politely before returning to his phone. Looking back now, he wasn't interested because he assumed there wasn't anything worth discovering. He judged people by appearances, and my parents intentionally appeared ordinary. The first 5 years of our marriage were happy. Then Daniel earned his first management position. The salary nearly doubled. We celebrated with takeout pizza because we still believed saving money mattered. He hugged me that night. We're finally getting somewhere. I kissed him. We've always been somewhere. He smiled then. I wish that version of him had survived. Instead, every promotion introduced him to people who measured success differently. His new coworkers belonged to private golf clubs. Their wives compared vacation homes. Every conversation became a competition. Who owned the nicest watch? Who drove the newest SUV? Whose spouse earned the highest income? Daniel slowly started playing their game. One evening, he returned from a corporate dinner unusually quiet. Finally, he asked, "Why don't you ever try to move up? I like my work. You could make more money. We already have enough." He looked frustrated. Enough isn't how successful people think. That sentence stayed with me because it wasn't something Daniel used to believe. It was something he'd borrowed. Months later, he began criticizing my clothes. "They're too simple." Then my car. "People notice these things than my friends. They're not exactly welcomed." I listened. I compromised. I bought nicer dresses, attended more networking dinners, smiled through conversations that left me exhausted. Nothing satisfied him. His expectations kept moving farther away. It wasn't really about money anymore. It was about status. He wanted admiration. He wanted people to envy him. Eventually, he wanted a wife who looked impressive standing beside him, not necessarily one who loved him. Back in the driveway, one of the employees carried out 2 small boxes containing family photographs, a few books, and my grandmother's quilt. Everything else remained inside the house. Daniel watched silently. Finally, he looked directly at my mother. "Mrs. Whitmore," she met his eyes. "Yes, I didn't know." "No." She nodded once. "You didn't." His voice cracked. "Emily never told me," my mother answered carefully. "Did you ever ask?" The silence that followed seemed to last forever because the truthful answer was obvious. No, he hadn't. Not once in 12 years. He had asked strangers about their salaries, co-workers about investment tips, neighbors about home values, but he'd never truly asked about the woman sharing his life. He thought he already knew everything worth knowing. Another black SUV slowly turned the corner. Unlike the others, this one carried 2 familiar faces. My father stepped out first, still tall despite his 72 years, still carrying himself with quiet confidence. Beside him walked a silver-haired gentleman wearing a tailored charcoal suit. Daniel frowned. Recognition flashed across his face. His breathing became shallow. I know him. I followed his gaze. Of course he did. The man extending his hand toward my father wasn't just another executive. He was Richard Lawson, the CEO of the logistics corporation where Daniel proudly worked. And at that very moment, Richard Lawson smiled warmly at my father before saying words that caused Daniel's knees to nearly buckle. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for meeting with the board this morning. We look forward to finalizing the acquisition." Daniel's face turned completely white. He suddenly understood exactly who my family really was, and he realized his career had been connected to them all along. The rain had finally stopped. The only sound left was the soft ticking of engines cooling beneath the row of black Escalades parked along our quiet suburban street. Neighbors had gathered discreetly on their porches. No one pretended they weren't watching anymore. In neighborhoods like ours, people usually respected each other's privacy. But this wasn't an ordinary divorce. This was the kind of moment people would still be talking about years later. Daniel stood frozen, staring at Richard Lawson, his boss, the man he'd spent years trying to impress. Richard shook my father's hand warmly before turning toward me. "Emily," he smiled. "It's good to see you again. It's good to see you." "You too, Richard." Daniel looked between us as if he no longer understood the English language. "You know each other." Richard chuckled. "I've known Emily since she was a teenager." Daniel blinked. "What?" my father answered calmly. "Richard served on our scholarship foundation long before he became CEO. Daniel slowly turned toward me. "You've met him before," I nodded. "Many times. He looked physically sick." "I don't understand." "No," I replied quietly. "I suppose you don't." Richard glanced politely toward Daniel before speaking to my father. "The acquisition documents are nearly complete." Dad nodded. "Excellent. We should have everything finalized by next week." Daniel interrupted before he could stop himself. "Acquisition." Richard looked at him with mild confusion. "Yes, our company is becoming part of Whitmore Holdings." Daniel's lips parted. I work there, I know." Richard's voice remained professional. "Your regional sales director." Daniel nodded mechanically. Richard smiled politely. "You've had solid sales numbers." For one brief second, hope returned to Daniel's face. Then Richard continued, "I understand your division has also experienced unusually high employee turnover." Daniel's shoulders stiffened well in several HR complaints. No one spoke. Daniel swallowed. Richard wasn't accusing him. He was simply stating facts. Facts that suddenly sounded much heavier than they had yesterday. My father gently placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "We'll discuss business Monday." Richard nodded. "Of course." Then he looked at Daniel again. "I hope everything works out for you personally." With that, he stepped away. No threats, no intimidation, just professionalism. That somehow made everything even worse. Daniel turned toward my father. "Mr. Whitmore." Dad looked at him patiently. "Yes, I didn't know Emily came from." He couldn't even finish the sentence. Dad smiled faintly. "You didn't know because you never wanted to know. 12 years. Dad spoke softly. 12 years, Daniel. You never once asked me how I started my career." Daniel lowered his eyes. "You never asked Emily about her childhood." Silence. "You never wondered why we insisted she build her own life." Another silence. "You decided who we were without ever taking the time to learn." Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. "I made a mistake." Dad nodded. "You certainly did." By one of the assistants quietly approached me. "Ms. Carter." "Yes, your belongings are packed." I looked toward the front door. Everything I truly cared about fit inside 6 medium-sized boxes. Family photographs, my grandmother's quilt, books, a few keepsakes, some clothes. That was all. It struck me how little of our shared life actually belonged to me anymore, or perhaps how little of it ever really had. I picked up the first box. Daniel instinctively stepped forward. "I'll carry that." I looked at him. For years, I would have accepted. Not today, no thank you. His hand slowly dropped back to his side. As another employee loaded my belongings into one of the SUVs, Daniel followed me across the driveway. "Emily," I kept walking. "Please." I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because after 12 years together, I felt he deserved one last chance to speak honestly. I was angry. His voice trembled. "I didn't mean you called my mother. I know. You called me useless. I know. You told her to come pick me up like I was unwanted furniture." Tears filled his eyes. I know. I searched his face for excuses, for blame, for anything. Instead, I saw fear, not grief. Fear. Fear of losing everything he'd just discovered. That realization hurt far more than his insults. If my parents had arrived in an old pickup truck, I asked quietly, "Would you still be apologizing?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out because we both already knew the answer. Several neighbors pretended to check their mail while listening. An elderly woman from across the street looked genuinely heartbroken. She'd watched us plant flowers together every spring. She'd brought us casseroles after Daniel's father passed away. She remembered the couple we used to be. I wished I could remember them that clearly myself. My mother walked over and gently squeezed my hand. Are you ready? I nodded, almost. She stepped back without saying another word. She knew I needed to close this chapter myself. Daniel took one slow step closer. I loved you. I smiled sadly. I believe you did. His eyes brightened slightly. But somewhere along the way, I continued. You started loving success more. He looked down. You stopped seeing me. You became embarrassed by me. You wanted a wife who looked expensive. Every sentence landed quietly. Not as revenge, as truth. I was standing beside you the whole time, I said. But you kept looking over my shoulder for someone better. His tears finally fell. I'm sorry. For the first time that morning, I believed those words were sincere. But sincerity doesn't erase consequences. I hope one day you become the man I married, I said. Because the man standing here today, I looked around the driveway. Isn't him? He covered his face. I took a deep breath. Then I spoke the sentence that would stay with him forever. You didn't lose a wealthy wife today. He looked up. You lost the only woman who loved you before success mattered. The words settled over the entire street. No one moved. Even the neighbors looked away. Not because the sentence was cruel, because it was painfully true. I climbed into the SUV beside my mother before the door closed. Daniel hurried forward one last time. Emily. I looked back. I never cheated on you. It seemed like such a strange thing to say, as though faithfulness alone excused everything else. I know, I answered, but respect is part of marriage too. The door closed softly. The convoy slowly pulled away. As we turned the corner, I looked back through the tinted window. Daniel was still standing alone in the driveway. The divorce papers had slipped from his hand. Rainwater carried them across the pavement for the first time in years. He looked completely small. We drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, my mother reached over and held my hand. You okay? I stared out the window. I don't know, she nodded. That's an honest answer. I keep wondering if I failed. She smiled gently. No, you loved someone completely. That's never failure. A few miles later, the convoy entered downtown Columbus. Instead of turning toward one of my parents' homes, the lead SUV pulled beneath the covered entrance of a beautiful historic hotel overlooking the Scioto River. Employees were already waiting outside. One greeted my mother respectfully. Mrs. Whitmore. Another smiled at me. Welcome home, Miss Carter. Home. The word felt unfamiliar, but for the first time that day, it also felt possible. As I stepped out of the SUV, I had no idea that rebuilding my life would begin right there. And I certainly didn't know that Daniel's greatest losses had only just begun. People love stories where karma arrives overnight. The arrogant husband loses everything. The betrayed wife becomes richer. Justice is instant. Life doesn't work that way, at least not in my experience. What happened after the divorce wasn't dramatic. It was quieter and somehow much more painful. 3 weeks after I left our house, my attorney called. Emily, I wanted to let you know we've received another proposal from Daniel's lawyer. I was sitting in the conference room at the Whitmore Foundation reviewing applications for grants that would help women leaving abusive relationships rebuild their lives. I leaned back in my chair. What does he want? He'd like to revisit the property settlement. I wasn't surprised. He signed everything voluntarily. I know. He says he wasn't fully aware of certain financial circumstances. I almost laughed. You mean he didn't know my parents were wealthy? There was a brief silence. That's essentially what he's arguing. I closed the file in front of me. We're not changing anything. I thought you'd say that. My attorney hesitated. Emily. Yes. Your parents aren't asking us to pursue anything. I know. They specifically instructed us to avoid making this difficult for him. I smiled to myself. That sounded exactly like Mom and Dad. Even now, they refuse to use wealth as a weapon. Contrary to what many people assumed, Whitmore Holdings never interfered with Daniel's career. My father made that absolutely clear during the first executive meeting following the acquisition. Richard Lawson told me about it several months later. Dad had looked around the boardroom and said only one sentence. We judge employees by performance, not personal history. That policy applied to everyone, including my ex-husband. If Daniel succeeded, he would keep succeeding. If he failed, the responsibility would be his alone. Unfortunately for Daniel, success had slowly been slipping away long before our marriage ended. Without someone quietly holding his personal life together, cracks started appearing everywhere. He forgot meetings, missed deadlines, responded sharply to employees. One regional manager transferred to another division after filing a complaint about Daniel's leadership style, then another. Within 6 months, 4 experienced team members had resigned. Richard didn't fire. He simply postponed Daniel's expected promotion again and again. Eventually, the position went to someone else. Not because of my family, because leadership requires more than impressive quarterly sales numbers. It requires people willing to keep following you. Daniel no longer had that. I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. The expensive downtown apartment he'd leased after the divorce became difficult to afford. His luxury SUV disappeared. The country club membership quietly expired. Coworkers stopped inviting him to exclusive dinners. It wasn't cruelty. It was something much simpler. Many of those friendships had never been real. They had revolved around status. Once his status faded, so did the invitations. I remembered warning him years earlier. Real friends don't care what you drive. Back then, he'd smiled dismissively. I know who my friends are, now so did he. As for the woman he'd started seeing shortly before our divorce, that relationship lasted barely 4 months. I never learned her full story. And honestly, I never wanted to. One afternoon, an old neighbor called me. I thought you should know. You don't have to tell me. No, Emily, you deserve to hear this. Apparently, she'd packed her belongings while Daniel was at work. She left behind only a handwritten note. It read, "You're not the man you pretended to be." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Meanwhile, my own life felt strangely unfamiliar. For the first month after the divorce, I kept waking up at 6 every morning. I'd automatically reach toward the empty side of the bed. Then reality would return. Some mornings I cried. Some mornings I simply stared at the ceiling. Healing isn't a straight line. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never truly lost someone they loved. My mother never rushed me. She'd knock gently on my apartment door inside the family guest house. Breakfast. Sometimes I joined her, sometimes I couldn't. Either way, she understood. Dad had his own quiet way of helping. Every Friday afternoon, he'd invite me to lunch, never to discuss business, never to discuss Daniel. Instead, we'd talk about baseball, fishing, books, childhood memories. He was reminding me without ever saying the words that my identity had never depended on being someone's wife. About 2 months after the divorce, Mom walked into my apartment carrying a folder. "I have a question." I looked up from the novel I wasn't really reading. "I'm listening." She placed the folder on the coffee table. "The foundation wants to expand. Inside were plans for a new initiative. Emergency housing, career counseling, financial education, legal assistance, everything designed to help women starting over after difficult marriages. I'd like you to lead it." I looked at her in surprise. "Mom, you've lived through it." "I'm not sure I'm ready." She smiled gently. "No one ever feels ready." I stared at the proposal for several minutes. Finally, I asked, "Why me?" She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Because pain either makes us bitter," she paused, "or it makes us useful." Those words settled deep inside me. I accepted the position the following week. The work changed me. Every day I met women whose stories humbled me. A nurse whose husband emptied their savings account. A grandmother raising 3 grandchildren after her daughter disappeared. A military spouse abandoned during cancer treatment. A teacher escaping years of emotional manipulation. Compared to some of their experiences, mine almost seemed easy. Yet every woman carried the same invisible burden. They all believed they weren't enough. Week after week, I watched confidence slowly return to their faces. One woman found her first apartment. Another started nursing school at 46. Another opened a small bakery. Their victories reminded me that beginning again isn't failure, it's courage. My therapist noticed the change before I did. During one session, she smiled. "You haven't mentioned Daniel once today." I blinked. She was right. For nearly an hour, we discussed future plans instead of old wounds. What does that mean? It means your story is becoming larger than your pain. I left her office that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in years. Forgiveness hadn't arrived yet, but freedom was beginning to. One autumn evening, nearly 10 months after the divorce, Dad invited me to dinner. After dessert, he turned on the television. The local news had just begun. A reporter stood outside our newest community resource center. Behind her was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Then, suddenly, my own face appeared on the screen. The reporter smiled into the camera. "Emily Carter, director of the New Beginnings Initiative, has helped more than 200 women transition into stable housing and employment during the program's first year." They showed interviews with several participants. One woman wiped away tears. "Emily never treated us like broken people." Another smiled. "She reminded me I still had value." I felt embarrassed watching myself. Dad looked impossibly proud. Mom quietly reached for another napkin to hide the tears in her eyes. Across town, in a small apartment, Daniel happened to be watching the same broadcast. A mutual acquaintance later told me he never changed the channel. He sat there until the program ended. Not because he envied my success, but because for the first time he finally saw the woman he'd spent 12 years overlooking, and he realized that the greatest thing he'd ever lost had never been money. It had been character standing faithfully beside him all along. People often imagine revenge as watching someone suffer. For a long time, I thought that was what I wanted. I imagined Daniel losing everything: his career, his reputation, his confidence. I imagined him feeling even a fraction of the loneliness he had left me with. But something unexpected happened during the second year after our divorce. The anger simply started running out, not because he'd earned forgiveness, because carrying resentment every day was exhausting. It felt like dragging a suitcase filled with rocks wherever I went. Eventually, I realized something. The divorce had already taken enough from me. I wasn't willing to let bitterness take anything else. Nearly 18 months after our marriage ended, I received an email from someone I hadn't expected to hear from again. The subject line simply read, "I owe you an apology." I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. There were no dramatic declarations, no requests to come back, no excuses, just a few short paragraphs. "Emily, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I'm not writing because I expect forgiveness. I'm writing because I've finally become honest enough to admit what I did. I spent years blaming everyone except myself. You deserved a husband who respected you. Instead, I made you feel invisible. If you're willing, I'd like 10 minutes of your time someday. If not, I'll understand." Daniel, I read it twice, then a third time. Finally, I closed my laptop without replying. A week later, I mentioned the email during lunch with my parents. Dad quietly buttered another piece of bread. Mom listened without interrupting. "What do you think?" I finally asked. Dad shrugged gently. "I think only you can answer that." Mom nodded. "You don't owe him a meeting, I know," but she smiled. "But you're wondering whether hearing him might help close the last door." Exactly. That was what I couldn't quite explain. I didn't miss my marriage. I didn't want Daniel back. But there was one final conversation our story had never had. 2 days later, I replied, an hour. Saturday, 10:00, Jefferson Coffee on Main Street, nothing more. His response arrived less than 5 minutes later. "Thank you." Jefferson Coffee hadn't changed in years. It was one of those independently owned places where the owner still remembered regular customers by name. The floors creaked. The coffee smelled incredible. Local artwork covered the brick walls. It felt safe, public, neutral. I arrived first. Old habit. At exactly 10:00, the front door opened. For a second, I barely recognized him. Daniel looked older than 43, not because of gray hair, because of humility. His expensive tailored suits were gone. Instead, he wore dark jeans, work boots, and a simple blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. He carried himself differently, too. Less like someone trying to impress a room, more like someone hopping not to disappoint it. When he reached the table, he didn't try to hug me. He didn't even offer his hand. "Thank you for coming," I nodded. "You have an hour." He sat quietly for several seconds before speaking. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, I figured." He smiled weakly, and every version sounded like I was making excuses. "So don't. I won't." The waitress brought our coffee. Neither of us touched it. Daniel folded his hands together. "The first thing I need to say is simple." He looked directly into my eyes. "I was emotionally abusive." The words surprised me. Not because they weren't true, because he actually said them without hesitation, without softening them. I kept telling myself I wasn't. His voice remained calm. "I thought because I never hit you, I wasn't hurting you." He looked down briefly. "I was wrong. I listened without speaking. I criticized everything. Your clothes, your career, your friends. I made you believe you were never enough." He inhaled slowly. "And the worst part," his voice cracked, "is that you kept trying harder." I remembered those years instantly. Buying different dresses, changing hairstyles, attending networking events I hated, cooking more, smiling more, apologizing for things that weren't my fault, trying desperately to become someone worthy of the man I loved. I hadn't realized until much later I had never been the one who needed to change. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. I brought something. He slid it across the table. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph, our first apartment. Someone had taken the picture during our second Christmas together. We were standing beside a tiny artificial tree decorated with mismatched ornaments. Neither of us owned expensive clothes. Neither of us cared. We looked happy. I found this while packing. He smiled sadly. I stared at it for hours. What did you see? Myself, he paused. Before ambition became arrogance. He told me about the counseling he'd started nearly a year earlier. Not because someone forced him, because he'd finally become tired of blaming the world. His therapist had asked one question that changed everything. When was the last time you admitted you were wrong without adding the word "but" afterward? Daniel couldn't answer. He realized almost every apology he'd ever given sounded like this. I'm sorry, but you. Or I'm sorry but work has been stressful, or I'm sorry but everyone else does it. Never simply I'm sorry. Counseling forced him to examine something much deeper than our failed marriage. His desperate need for approval, his obsession with appearing successful, his fear that ordinary meant worthless. The irony, he said quietly, is that chasing respect made me lose the respect of the only person who freely gave it. Finally, he looked back at me. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm glad. I know we're over. I appreciated that. So why did you ask to meet? He took a deep breath because I couldn't keep pretending I was the victim. Silence settled between us. Then he continued, I called your mother. Yes, I called you useless. Another pause. I've hated myself for that sentence ever since. He wiped his eyes. I wanted you to know that every single day. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked the question I'd carried for almost 2 years. Tell me honestly if my family had been poor. He already knew how the sentence ended. Would you still have left me? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, the honesty hurt. And strangely, it also healed because it confirmed something important. The divorce hadn't happened because of money. It happened because his character had been failing long before either of us recognized it. Thank you, I said quietly, for telling me the truth. When we stood to leave, Daniel reached for the check. I smiled. We'll split it. He nodded. Fair enough. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. Before we walked in opposite directions, I stopped. I forgive you. He looked stunned. I didn't say I forgot. I didn't say what happened was acceptable. I forgive you because I don't want to carry it anymore. Tears rolled down his face. I don't deserve that. No, I answered honestly. You don't. But forgiveness isn't earned. It's chosen. A week later, Daniel asked whether he could apologize to my parents. To my surprise, they agreed. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Dad listened quietly. Mom accepted his apology with the same grace she had shown the day she arrived in that convoy of black SUVs. Before he left, she offered him one final piece of advice. Daniel, he looked up, never measure another person's worth by what they own. She smiled gently because character has a way of revealing itself. Eventually, he nodded through tears. I finally learned that as he walked away, I realized something remarkable. For the first time since our divorce, neither of us was walking away in anger. We were simply walking toward different futures. 3 years have a funny way of changing people. Not all at once, not with some dramatic moment that makes the world stop spinning. Just little choices, little lessons, little acts of courage repeated often enough that one day you wake up and realize you're no longer the person you used to be. When I look back now, the woman sitting in that kitchen signing divorce papers feels like someone I once knew instead of someone I still am. She was kind. She was loyal. But she believed her worth depended on being chosen by someone else. The woman I became finally understood something much more important. My worth had never been up for debate. The New Beginnings initiative continued to grow beyond anything I had imagined. What started as a small local program serving women in central Ohio expanded into neighboring counties. Then another state partnered with us. Then another. We weren't becoming famous. That was never the goal. We were becoming useful. Every week, I sat across from women who reminded me of the person I used to be. Some had survived financial abuse. Some had survived years of emotional manipulation. Some arrived carrying children and nothing else. Others carried expensive purses and invisible wounds no one had ever noticed. Pain doesn't care about income. Neither does hope. One afternoon, a woman in her late 50s stayed behind after a financial planning workshop. She hesitated before speaking. I almost didn't come. Why? I asked. She smiled nervously. I thought everyone here would be younger. I laughed softly. Starting over doesn't have an age limit. Tears filled her eyes. My husband left after 32 years. She looked around the room. I don't even know who I am anymore. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. I do. She looked confused. You're someone who's still here. That's where rebuilding begins. A year later, she sent me a Christmas card. She had opened a small accounting business. She signed the card with one sentence I'll never forget. "Thank you for reminding me that life wasn't over just because one chapter ended." I kept that card in my desk drawer. Whenever I doubted whether our work mattered, I read it again. My parents gradually stepped back from day-to-day business operations. Dad finally admitted he enjoyed fishing more than board meetings. Mom joked that retirement simply meant attending fewer meetings and volunteering more hours. One spring afternoon, the three of us sat on the porch of their home overlooking a quiet lake outside Cleveland. Dad leaned back in his chair. "You know," he smiled, "your grandfather would have been proud." I looked at him. "Because of the business," he laughed. "No, because you remembered why he built it." I frowned slightly. "I thought he built it to provide for the family." "He did," Dad nodded, "but not only for us." He pointed toward a newspaper article lying on the table. It featured one of our scholarship recipients, a single father who had become an engineer after returning to school in his 40s. "Your grandfather used to say," Dad smiled, "money only keeps its value when it keeps helping people." I looked across the lake. For the first time, I truly understood what my parents had spent my entire life trying to teach me. Wealth wasn't measured by what sat in a bank account. It was measured by the number of lives made lighter because you existed. People often ask whether I ever fell in love again. The answer is yes, but not when I was looking for it. His name was Michael. He was a high school history teacher and a widower raising a teenage daughter. We met at one of our community fundraising dinners, not because he was donating, because his students had organized a volunteer project for our program. The first thing I noticed wasn't his smile. It was how carefully he listened. When people spoke, he actually heard them. Months later, during one of our early dates, I nervously told him the entire story of my marriage. When I finished, I apologized. "I'm sorry for what?" "For bringing all that baggage." He reached across the table and gently took my hand. "Emily," his voice was warm and steady, "your past explains you. It doesn't reduce your value." Such a simple sentence. Yet I realized no one had ever said those words to me before. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony attended by family, close friends, and many women whose lives had crossed mine through new beginnings. There were no extravagant decorations, no magazine photographers, just laughter, children running across the lawn, homemade pie, a string quartet from the local university. It was everything my first wedding hadn't been. Peaceful, authentic enough. As for Daniel, life became quieter for him, too. Not perfect, just honest. Richard Lawson eventually told me something that made me smile. Daniel had voluntarily stepped down from management. Instead of chasing executive promotions, he accepted a role training newly hired sales representatives. At first, Richard thought it was a strange decision. Then he watched Daniel work. Apparently, he had become remarkably patient. He listened. He encouraged. He admitted mistakes openly. One day, a young employee asked him how to become successful. Daniel reportedly answered, "Don't confuse admiration with respect. They're not the same thing." Richard laughed when he told me that story. "I think he's finally figured it out." I believed he had. Every Thanksgiving, our foundation hosted a community dinner for families going through difficult seasons. Volunteers served meals. Children decorated cookies. Local musicians played old American classics. 3 years after our divorce, I looked across the room while greeting guests. There stood Daniel. He was wearing a volunteer apron, serving mashed potatoes, smiling at an elderly veteran. There was no awkwardness, no bitterness. When he noticed me, he walked over. "Hi, Emily. Hi, Daniel." "Looks like we both stayed busy." We did. He glanced around the crowded room. "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For giving me." I smiled. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," he nodded. "You did it for yourself." And maybe he looked toward the families eating together. It gave me permission to become someone better, too. I didn't answer immediately because some moments don't need many words. Instead, I simply smiled. Then we returned to serving dinner. Two people whose lives had once been defined by pain, now quietly helping strangers. That felt like the ending our story deserved. Sometimes people still ask about the day my mother arrived with 6 black SUVs. They expect me to say that was the moment everything changed. They're only partly right. That convoy revealed the truth, but it didn't create it. The real turning point came much later. The day I stopped measuring my value through someone else's opinion. The day Daniel accepted responsibility without asking for excuses. The day forgiveness became stronger than revenge. If you've listened to my story this far, I hope you'll remember this. Never underestimate a quiet person. Never assume someone's worth based on what you can see. The richest people aren't always the ones with the biggest homes or the most expensive cars. They're the ones whose character remains intact when no one is watching. And if someone ever makes you feel small, remember this. Their inability to recognize your value does not diminish it. Not then, not now, not ever. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share one of the hardest chapters of my life. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of someone you love, or gave you hope to begin again, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, forgiveness, and finding strength after life's hardest moments, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me again.